Number 12. The disciplined fire. A single number changed the British Army's future. 300 Bren guns a week coming out of Enfield by 1938. It does not sound like a miracle weapon. It sounds like logistics, production, paperwork. But hidden inside that number is a new idea of war. Reliability mattered as much as firepower. A squad's survival could depend on a weapon accurate enough to trust under pressure. The Bren did not come from a British drawing board. It grew out of Czech designs, first the ZBVZ-26, then the ZGB-33, before Britain adapted it into something standard across the Commonwealth. Top-mounted magazine, quick-change barrel, around 500 to 520 rounds per minute. By the time Dunkirk arrived in 1940, it was already a frontline fixture. Which of these weapons was actually the first step toward the modern battlefield, and which one only looked like it could change history? The paperwork trail starts in the middle of the 1930s, when British officers went looking for a light machine gun that could do what the old Lewis gun could not. They wanted accuracy. They wanted dependability. They wanted something a section could carry, feed, and trust when the shooting started and the ground was shaking. The answer came from Czechoslovakia, and that detail mattered more than the army liked to admit. The gun had to be licensed, adapted, and made fit for British service, but the core idea was already there. A Czech weapon, reshaped for an empire that needed something better than what it had. The name itself told the story. Bren. Brno and Enfield fused together. One part origin, one part manufacturing. The weapon was stamped with both at once, like a signature and a receipt. British production began in September 1937 at the Royal Small Arms Factory in Enfield. That is where the design stopped being a foreign solution and started becoming a British one. By March 1938, Britain and Canada had signed a contract for 5,000 guns for the UK and 7,000 for Canada. By the end of that same year, weekly production at Enfield had reached 300. That speed says something important. Britain was not just buying a gun, it was building a system around it. The Bren was heavy for a light machine gun. The early Mark I pattern weighed about 22 pounds, but the weight came with balance. The 30-round magazine sat on top, not underneath, and gave the gun its unmistakable silhouette. Gunners learned to move with that shape, and some even painted it or covered it with canvas to break up the outline. A weapon built for precision should not have looked so exposed, but war has its own sense of irony. The Bren's reputation came from what it did when the section needed controlled fire. It was not a spray-and-pray gun. It was an anchor. The quick-change barrel let crews keep it working under pressure. The top-mounted magazine fed cleanly. The gun's accuracy became famous enough that it sometimes created problems of its own. At Dunkirk, a chief petty officer preferred a Lewis gun for a small boat because the Bren was too accurate for noisy, improvised firing from a moving craft. That is the kind of complaint only a very good weapon can inspire. By 1940, the Bren was already a frontline British infantry weapon, and it went into the evacuation from Dunkirk as if it had always belonged there. Men carried it off beaches under fire. Men used it in North Africa, in Italy, in Northwest Europe. Not because it was the most violent gun in the war, because it was the one they trusted when a section had to hold together. In a British infantry section, the Bren was the center of gravity. Rifles moved around it. Orders moved around it. Survival moved around it. The quiet shift is hiding inside the Bren's history. The weapon did not win by sounding terrifying. It won by being predictable. A gun that could be fed, cooled, and kept on target was more useful than one that only looked powerful in a diagram. Britain had chased a light machine gun for years, and when it finally settled on one, it chose a design that came from outside its own workshops. That should have felt like compromise. Instead, it became standard. There is a reason this gun matters in a story about secret weapons. Not every battlefield-changing weapon arrives with a roar. Some arrive in factories. Some arrive in licensing agreements. Some arrive because an army realizes that the future belongs to the weapon that can be depended on by ordinary men under extraordinary pressure. The Bren was not exotic. It was disciplined. It made fire controllable. It made a section more stable. It made Britain and the Commonwealth rethink what a light machine gun should be. A weapon built from Czech ideas, made in Enfield, and carried from Dunkirk to the last corners of the war, ended up shaping how infantry expected to fight. Quietly, repeatedly, almost without drama. In a war full of machines that promised shock, the Bren earned loyalty by refusing to fail. Number 11. The Self-Loading Leap. John C. Garand was born on January 1, 1888 in Saint-Rémy, Quebec. The rifle that carried his name would spend the next half-century proving that a man in a trench could matter as much as a machine in a factory. The Army officially adopted his rifle on January 9, 1936. That date sounds bureaucratic. It was not. It was the moment the M1 stopped being an idea and became a promise to every American infantryman who would have to reload under fire. Garand had spent years at Springfield Armory refining a semi-automatic .30 caliber rifle that used expanding gas to drive the action, the way a steam engine uses pressure to move a piston. Clean, mechanical, almost stubbornly elegant. He did not build it to be admired in a glass case. He built it to be carried. At about 9.5 pounds, it was not light. It was still lighter than the burden of a machine gun team, and it gave one rifleman something the enemy bolt-action rifle could not match: a faster second shot, and then a third, and then another without breaking position. The American soldier no longer had to work the bolt every time he wanted to stay alive. He could keep his cheek welded to the stock and keep firing. On October 30, 1940, Garand presented a completed rifle to President Franklin D. Roosevelt at Springfield. The photograph from that moment looks almost ceremonial. A clean weapon in a clean room. But outside that room, the world was already moving toward a war that would swallow whole armies. Inside a few years, that rifle would be shipped in bulk to men heading for Normandy, Okinawa, and later Incheon. The neat presentation would give way to mud, salt spray, jungle heat, and the pressure of survival. Garand's rifle fed from an 8-round en-bloc clip. That little chunk of metal became part of the rifle's personality. It snapped in fast. It vanished fast. When the last round went, the clip kicked out with a sharp metallic ping that later became part of the rifle's mythology. Soldiers heard it. Enemies heard it too. But the real advantage was not the sound. It was tempo. A bolt-action enemy fired, worked the bolt, fired again. The M1 kept its rhythm. 6 shots that could beat an enemy bolt-action rhythm changed the American rifleman forever. Not because every soldier became a marksman overnight, because the ordinary rifleman could now answer a threat faster than the man facing him expected. The gap between one shot and the next got smaller. In combat, that gap is where lives are taken or saved. Garand himself never turned the rifle into a private fortune. Official records make that part very plain. He offered it to the government royalty-free. He could have asked for a piece of every rifle built after him. He did not. The gun went to war as a public weapon, not a patent play. Then production took over. Building 104 at Springfield Armory became a machine for making the future in steel and walnut. During the war, the rifle was mass-produced at high speed there, and Springfield alone turned out more than 3.5 million rifles, with total output crossing 3,719,000 by the end of World War II. That is not just scale, that is an industrial rhythm big enough to arm divisions. One rifle became the standard image of the American infantryman because millions of rifles reached millions of hands on time. By 1939, the rifle was already being photographed in Garand's hands. By 1957, it would be replaced by the M14. That is the hard edge of military history. Even a great weapon becomes yesterday's standard eventually. But for the war it lived through, the M1 was the rifle that made the ordinary American private feel a little less ordinary. John Garand built the rifle between the wars. The Army adopted it before the world fully burned. Then the war came, and the rifle proved that a faster follow-up shot could matter more than almost anything else a foot soldier carried. Garand did not become famous for inventing a legend. He became famous because he gave the legend a faster trigger finger. Number 10. The Factory War. 5 stamped parts and 1 folding stock turned a submachine gun into a wartime mass product. In 1940, that was the whole trick. Germany did not need a prettier gun. It needed a gun that could be made faster, with less machine work, by more hands, in more places. That was the job the MP40 was built to do. Look at the surviving example in the Imperial War Museum's collection, and the details are blunt. It was assembled at Steyr-Daimler-Puch in Austria in 1940. It fires 9mm ammunition. It feeds from a 32-round magazine. The stock folds in, so the gun shrinks down to about 610mm in length. With the stock extended, it reaches 855mm. In the hand, it was compact enough for the kind of war Germany was actually fighting. Not parade ground war, close war, crowded war. War inside houses, beside trucks, around rubble, out of hatchways and trenches. The old MP38 had already shown the shape of that idea. The MP40 made it practical. The change was not glamorous. Stamped steel instead of heavily machined parts. A simpler production method. A design that could be broken into pieces and pushed through a wider industrial system. The subcontractors fed a central factory. The central factory kept the guns moving. That mattered in 1940, when Germany was preparing for a long war and every hour of production had to count. On paper, the MP40 looks almost restrained. No giant caliber, no dramatic silhouette, no mechanical fireworks. But the restraint is the point. It was built to solve a factory problem as much as a battlefield problem. The Smithsonian notes that the weapon evolved from the MP38 after misfiring problems were corrected. A small mechanical fix. That kind of detail rarely gets the movie treatment, but it is exactly how wartime weapons become real. A gun that works most of the time is a problem. A gun that works reliably and can be made in volume becomes an army standard. And that is where the MP40 lands. In German service, it became the standard submachine gun of the Second World War. Infantry carried it, paratroopers carried it. Vehicle crews liked it because the folding stock kept it practical in tight spaces. It was never just one type of soldier's weapon. It was a tool for movement. A gun for the moments when a rifle was too long, too slow, or too awkward to bring up fast. You can see the wartime logic in the markings, too. On the museum example, the stamped codes read 4132A, WAA 625, 660, and 40. Dry little numbers. Factory language. The kind of marks that tell you this was not a custom object, not a showcase piece, but something built inside a system. That system is the real story. Between 1940 and 1944, the Smithsonian says more than 1 million MP40s were produced. More than 1 million. In war terms, that is not a side project. That is a manufacturing campaign. And yet, the MP40 was never a miracle weapon. It did not change the rules of war by itself. It did something more ordinary, and in some ways, more important. It translated Germany's need for mobile firepower into mass production. That is a quieter kind of power, less legend, more logistics, less myth, more steel. The gun's fame grew because it looked modern and sounded modern and showed up everywhere the war turned close and ugly. But what made it matter was the factory behind it. This is the part people miss when they see a weapon and start talking only about battlefield effect. The MP40 was a compromise that worked, a cheaper answer to a harder industrial reality. It was designed so production could be spread, so subcontractors could feed the main plant, so the machine tool time did not choke the program. That is the hidden battlefield inside every war economy. Before a soldier ever fires a burst, a dozen shops have already decided whether the burst can exist at all. By the time the gun reached mass service, the war had already swallowed the neat distinction between front line and rear. Factories became part of the fighting. Austria became part of the output. Steyr-Daimler-Puch in 1940 is not just a place name on a museum tag. It is a snapshot of Europe under pressure, where steel was being turned into something portable, repeatable, and immediate. One gun at a time. 1,000,000 times over. The MP40 does not stand for technical genius in the way a radical prototype does. It stands for adaptation under strain. Germany wanted a weapon built faster, cheaper, and in larger numbers. The MP40 was the answer. Not perfect, not magical, just good enough to move through an industrial war. That is the hard fact. Number 9. The iconic sidearm. 4 decades after its birth, this pistol still meant German authority to anyone who saw it. The codename was Pistole 08. The model was the Luger P08. The story usually starts with the look, the long barrel, the angled grip, the toggle action snapping up and back like a machine drawing a line in the air. It was elegant in a way most military weapons were not. It looked precise before anyone even fired it. That was the point. In 1908, the Imperial German Army adopted it as its official service pistol. That was not decoration, it was a statement. The paper trail is plain. The Army wanted a self-loading sidearm that could reload faster than a revolver. Officers needed one. Artillery crews needed one. Specialists needed one. Germany was moving into a war where a compact pistol could matter more than people liked to admit. A weapon that sat at a hip, not in a trench. A weapon that could be drawn fast, fired fast, and carried without the bulk of a rifle. The Luger fit that brief so well that it became part of the German image almost immediately. Then the war began. On the Western Front, the pistol became more than an official sidearm. It became a prize, a trophy. Men recognized it at a glance because its shape was so distinctive that even across mud and smoke it looked different from everything else. A British or French soldier who got hold of one knew exactly what he had. A German pistol. A real one. That mattered in the field because the Luger did not look like a relic. It looked like the future had arrived in a holster. Collectors and museums keep circling back to the same dates: 1915, 1916, 1917. These are not random numbers. They show the pistol stayed inside the German war machine through the conflict. An Imperial War Museum's example from 1915. Another from 1916 with a battlefield connection to the Somme. A Luger Pistole 08 dated 1917. The trail is not vague. Factory, date, war use. That is the whole story in metal. The details are specific. One example measures 22.4 centimeters. Another is 210 millimeters long. One Luger Pistole 08 weighs 1.013 kilograms. These are not just catalog numbers. They tell you what kind of weapon this was in the hand. Compact enough to carry, heavy enough to feel serious. Built for a soldier who needed a sidearm that would not disappear into the uniform. But the Luger had a problem that the myth never mentions loudly enough. It was beautiful, and it was demanding. It was prized for precision and modern self-loading speed compared with revolvers. It was also expensive and difficult to make. The mechanism had to be made carefully. The parts had to fit. The whole gun rewarded good manufacturing and punished shortcuts. That is a fine quality if you are making a prestige weapon. It is a terrible quality if you are trying to arm armies by the million. German soldiers still kept using it. That tells you what the army valued. Not just neat engineering, not just prestige, familiarity. A proven sidearm, a weapon officers trusted, a weapon already tied to German authority. Even when newer pistols existed, the P08 kept showing up in memoirs, trophies, and occupation inventories. The gun had become bigger than its original role. It was no longer merely a sidearm. It was a symbol. You can see the contrast in the museum record. A 1915 DWM-produced Pistole 08. A 1916 example linked to Beaumont Hamel and the Somme. A 1917 Luger Pistole 08. Same family, same German military identity. Different years, different battle context. The pistol kept moving through the war, one issue after another, while the industrial logic of the next age was already closing in around it. The myth says this was the definitive German pistol, the one that defined an era by itself. The evidence is colder. It was admired because it looked modern. It was used because it worked. It stayed because Germany had not yet fully replaced it with something simpler to mass produce. In other words, it survived the war not because it was the easiest answer, but because the better answer had not fully arrived. So the official story is neat. The Imperial German Army adopted the Pistola 08 in 1908, a refined, self-loading pistol. Precise, lethal, modern. The real story is messier. The gun was admired, carried, captured, and kept in service because war had a long memory, and armies move slower than legends do. The Luger became the pistol everyone recognized. It just never became the cheap, simple weapon history would have needed to let it rule. Number 8. The sound of fear. 3,000 rounds a minute made Allied soldiers hear the war before they saw it. A sound like canvas ripping, like a giant zipper tearing open in the dark. The men who faced it did not need a briefing to know something ugly was coming. They heard the first burst, and the whole line changed shape. In 1941, the German army wanted a successor to the MG-34, cheaper, faster to make, still deadly. The old gun was respected, but it was too refined for a war that was chewing through metal, labor, and time. By 1942, the answer was in service, the MG-42. It was not built like the weapons that came before it. That was the point. Instead of finely machined parts, it leaned hard on stamped steel, pressing, welding, and riveting. The gun was designed the way a factory under strain thinks. Less hand-fitting, less time lost, more weapons out the door. In a war economy, that was a weapon in itself. The result was ugly in the best possible wartime way. The MG-42 used the 7.92 by 57 mm Mauser cartridge. It weighed 11.85 kilograms in a 1944 Imperial War Museum's example. It stretched 1,220 millimeters from end to end, a long, heavy machine gun. But when it opened up, weight stopped being the first thing men remembered. Sound did. The firing rate is the number that turns the MG-42 into a legend. 1,200 rounds per minute is the common post-war figure. Wartime German firing data pushed it closer to 1,500. That means the gun was not just firing fast, it was stitching space shut. A burst came so quickly that individual shots blurred together. To the men on the receiving end, it was not a series of bangs, it was one continuous tear. A machine gun like that changes how a soldier thinks in the moment. You do not count shots. You wait for a gap. You listen for the pause that never seems to come. You stay down because the muzzle climb, the recoil, the repetition, all of it tells you this weapon is built to keep you pinned. It was not only a killer. It was a shock device. It arrived before the bullets were even understood. There was a price for that speed. The barrel heated fast. Ammunition disappeared at an ugly pace. A gun that could throw out that much fire also burned through its own usefulness if the crew abused it. So the MG-42 forced discipline even as it inspired fear. The gun could overwhelm a position. It could also make a crew work hard to keep it alive. High rate of fire meant high barrel heating and heavy ammunition consumption. That was the trade. In 1943, the design had already settled into its wartime form enough that the special muzzle brake used from that year to the end of the war became part of its identity. The gun was not some elegant peacetime invention. It was a battlefield answer, adjusted under pressure, shaped by shortages and battlefield need. Every part of it looks like a decision made with urgency, and that urgency mattered. The MG-42 was not just a faster MG-34. That story is too tidy. The real difference was industrial. The German army needed something that could be built more quickly, in greater numbers, by a system already straining under war. The gun's genius was not only in how it fired, it was in how it could be made. That is why it spread. Not because it was pretty, not because it was clever in a peacetime way, because it fit a desperate production system. The old world of careful machining gave way to the logic of stamped steel and simplified manufacture. A gun built to solve a factory problem ended up terrifying men in foxholes. If you were there, the first clue was the sound. Not the flash, not the impact, the sound. You hear it coming from somewhere in front of you, and now the field is smaller. The trench is smaller. The hedge line is smaller. Even the sky seems closer because the noise is moving through it so fast. By the late war period, the MG42 had become one of Germany's signature guns. Not because Germany was winning. It wasn't. But because the weapon itself had become unmistakable. Men remembered it. Allied troops remembered it. They gave it a place in memory the way armies always do with the things that nearly kill them. After the war, its lineage did not end. The MG3 carried that roller-locked family forward. Same basic idea, same brutal reputation. Different flag. Germany lost the war, but the gun's design ideas kept walking into the future. The weapon outlived the state that fielded it. So when soldiers talked about the MG42, they did not describe it like a normal machine gun. They described a noise that arrived first and a target that came later. They described a wall of fire that seemed to move faster than thought. In a war of rifles, pistols, grenades, rockets, and tanks, that sound was enough to freeze a whole line in place. The battlefield did not need to see the gun to know it was there. The line went quiet. The muzzle kept flashing. Then, the barrel changed. Number 7. The rifle that created a category. Two worlds of infantry combat collided, and one new rifle solved both badly at once. A German soldier in 1943 could know the problem before he ever saw the solution. His ordinary rifle hit hard, but in a ruined village, it felt long and awkward, a piece of wood and steel that wanted space Germany did not have. The submachine gun was the opposite, handy in a doorway, useless when the enemy was farther out, behind a tree line, or across a field cut by shell holes. So the ordnance people did something very German and very practical. They tried to build one weapon for both jobs. The cartridge came first. 7.92 by 33 mm Kurz, shorter than a full rifle round, stronger than pistol ammunition. The middle ground, in other words, which is exactly where armies usually end up after the romantic ideas break against mud. Then came the gun built around it. Select fire, 30-round box magazine. A weapon meant to be carried by infantry, not parked in a workshop and admired by engineers. In 1943, the first prototypes went to the Eastern Front for field trials. There, the rifle stopped being a concept and became a problem with opinions. German infantry picked it up and immediately understood what it was trying to do. It was lighter than the old long rifles. It was controllable enough to fire in bursts without climbing into the clouds. It still reached farther than a pistol-caliber submachine gun. You could move with it. You could fire from cover with it. You could clear a house with it and still shoot at a man running across open ground. That combination mattered more than any single statistic. A rifleman did not have to choose between range and speed in the same brutal way anymore. He could have both, just not in perfect form. The compromise was the point. The weapon was still developing when it reached the front. Early reports from the East were simple. Men liked it. Commanders noticed. Ammunition felt different in the hand. The recoil was easier to live with. The muzzle did not jump like a punishing rifle. A soldier could keep the sights on target longer. He could fire, correct, fire again. In a close fight, that meant survival. In a longer fight, it meant the other man had to respect the weapon more than he expected to. In 1944, the gun received its name, Sturmgewehr 44, assault rifle. That word did not just label a weapon, it helped create a category. Before that, armies had rifles, carbines, and submachine guns. They had machine guns. They had odd in-between things that fit nowhere cleanly. The STG-44 gave that in-between space a name that sounded useful, aggressive, and modern. Not a defensive weapon, not a hunter's tool. Something meant for storming, pushing, taking ground. The name itself was a political move as much as a technical one. It told the army what this thing was for. It told the public what kind of war Germany still claimed it could fight. By then, the war was already turning into ruin around Germany. Factories were under pressure, supply lines were cracking, fuel was short. The STG-44 reached combat units in too small numbers to change the strategic picture. It was not a miracle. It was a good answer arriving in a collapsing room. Still, men who saw it remembered it. American troops first encountered the STG-44 in the Ardennes in December 1944. Imagine that moment. Cold woods, snow, a battle already full of confusion. Then a German rifle comes out of the trees with a 30-round magazine and a rate of fire that does not fit the old categories. It does not behave like the rifles the Americans know. It does not sound like the pistols and submachine guns they expect at close range. It is something in between. And in war, in between often means dangerous in a way the manuals did not prepare for. The numbers give the shape of it. 500 to 600 rounds per minute. Effective range around 300 meters on automatic fire, farther on semi-automatic. Not just full auto. Full auto with enough control to stay useful. Not just a rifle cartridge, an intermediate one built so the weapon could be carried and fired like an infantryman actually fought. It was never about making the biggest burst. It was about making the burst count. Hugo Schmeisser is the name usually attached to the design lineage because wartime weapons rarely belong to one clean inventor the way museum labels pretend. They belong to teams, shops, pressure, deadlines, and stolen moments in broken states. But the line that mattered was visible in the metal itself. The STG-44 was not trying to be a heavier rifle or a lighter machine gun. It was trying to be a new kind of infantry answer. Once armies saw that answer, they could not unsee it. You can stand in front of one now and still feel the shift it represents. The receiver looks practical. The magazine sits low and long. The whole gun feels designed around the soldier's movement, not just around ballistic purity. The rifle did not win because it was prettier, or because it had the highest rate of fire, or because it arrived in huge numbers. It won a different contest. It proved that infantry firepower could be reorganized around the distance men actually fought at. That idea spread after the war, not as a trophy, as a template. Armies studied it because it showed a path forward that old rifles and old submachine guns could not offer on their own. One cartridge, one weapon type, enough range to matter, enough automatic fire to matter. A compromise, yes, but a productive one. The STG-44 came too late to save Germany. It was too late, too limited, too small in number to change the war it was built for. But it changed the language of war itself. After 1944, every army had to think about the same question in a new way. What if the standard infantry weapon was neither a rifle nor a submachine gun, but something that borrowed from both and forced the battlefield to catch up? The answer was already sitting in the mud by then, with a 30-round magazine and a name that would outlive the regime that gave it to the world. Number 6. The American answer. One shoulder-fired tube turned ordinary infantry into tank hunters almost overnight. The German answer was not another machine gun. It was a new kind of rifle that would shape the future of warfare. The American answer came from a different problem. In 1942, an infantryman needed something he could carry alone, raise to his shoulder, and fire at steel without hauling a cannon behind him. The solution did not begin with a famous weapon. It began with an army officer at Aberdeen Proving Ground, Edward Uhl. Uhl was not chasing legend. He was trying to make a tank killer small enough for one man to carry. The army already had shape-charge warheads that could bite through armor. What it lacked was a practical way to launch one from a tube on a soldier's shoulder. Uhl put the hollow charge grenade on a rocket and paired it with a simple launcher. That was the breakthrough. Not glamour, a way to deliver the warhead. At Aberdeen, senior officers saw the idea and understood it immediately. By May 1942, General Electric had already built 5,000 launchers. The official name was the 2.36-inch rocket launcher M1. The men who used it called it something else. Bazooka. It started as a joke, borrowed from Bob Burns's homemade musical instrument. The long tube and front sight looked close enough to make someone laugh on the test range. The name stayed. The weapon itself looked simple. A 55-inch tube, 2.36 inches in caliber. One man could carry it, aim it, and fire it. That mattered in the war the Army was now fighting. Not long lines of guns. Not crews dragging heavy hardware through mud. A soldier, a tube, and a rocket that could turn a tank into a burning machine if everything worked the way it was supposed to. It entered combat in November 1942 during Operation Torch in North Africa. That was the test. Not a demonstration room, not a proving ground. Desert fighting. Dust. Heat. German armor. The bazooka proved the idea worked. It gave infantry a chance against tanks without waiting for artillery. But the early ammunition was shaky. Firing problems appeared. Rockets failed. Reliability trailed the promise. The Army kept refining it. By late 1943, the M9 had arrived with a better rocket, the M6A3. It was still the bazooka, but now the battlefield could trust it more often. Even then, tank crews did not make things easy. German armor grew thicker. Front plates grew tougher. Bazooka teams adapted. They learned where a shot might count: tracks, sides, rear engine compartments. Anywhere the steel was weaker. This is where WWII's work stops feeling like an invention story and becomes a battlefield story. A shoulder-fired tube changed what infantry could do. It did not make tanks irrelevant. It made them vulnerable to a man on foot with a clear line of sight and enough nerve to hold position long enough to squeeze the trigger. By 1944, the Army was already developing the larger M20 Super Bazooka. The armor race was moving faster than the first launcher could keep up. The bazooka did not end that contest. It opened it. Once one man could carry anti-tank power on his shoulder, every army had to assume infantry might bring more than rifles and grenades. Tanks had to think differently about close range. Designers had to plan for a soldier who no longer needed a gun crew to threaten armor. It started with a problem at Aberdeen in 1942, and one officer who found a way to launch a hollow charge warhead from a rocket tube. WWII built a weapon that changed the scale of the fight. Now, put yourself in North Africa in November 1942. Sand in the air, engines coughing somewhere ahead, a tube on your shoulder, a tank moving toward you. No cannon, no crew. One shot. A name that sounds like a joke. Then the rocket leaves the tube and the joke ends. The cutoff came fast after that. Number 5. The cheap tank killer. Out of 10 numbers on a factory ledger could decide whether a tank lived or died. In the summer of 1942, German engineers were not chasing a grand battlefield fantasy. They were trying to solve a very small, very ugly problem. How does one infantryman stop a tank at close range without dragging a gun behind him? The answer began as the Faust Patrone, a crude little precursor. Then it became the Panzerfaust, a disposable launcher, a hollow charge warhead, a recoilless shove of metal and explosives built for one job only. Get close, fire once, walk away if you can. At first, the weapon looked almost too simple to matter. But that was the point. Simple could be stamped out. Simple could be handed to soldiers with little training. Simple could be made in numbers that artillery pieces never could. The first versions reached troops in August 1943 and September 1943. By then, the German army was already learning what kind of weapon this really was. Not a dueling machine for open fields, a street weapon, a hedge weapon, a cellar weapon. It needed distance, but not much. 30 meters, 60 meters, 100 meters, depending on the model and the moment. Close enough to smell smoke. Close enough to hear the engine before the shot. The early prototype had not even been perfect. One report from the development path describes it bouncing off sloped T-34 armor. That failure mattered. It pushed the design toward a much better shaped charge solution. The warhead did not need brute force. It needed geometry. The blast focused inward. The armor gave way from the inside out. That is the hard little genius of the Panzerfaust. It was cheap because it was meant to be expendable. It was deadly because it did not need speed or range to ruin a tank crew's day. By September 1944, the Panzerfaust 60 had become the standard wartime version. It was the one that spread everywhere, the one that mattered most. The numbers tell the story in a cold row. 1.8-pound warhead, up to 8 inches of armor claimed for the improved model. 8.3 million produced by the end of the war, in one widely cited estimate. That is not a niche weapon. That is factory output so large it starts to look like policy. Then came the cities. By 1945, the Panzerfaust was no longer just an anti-tank tool for frontline soldiers. It had become a last-ditch weapon for a collapsing state. On October 18, 1944, it is specifically noted as being distributed to the Volkssturm, the emergency defenders pulled from the wreckage of the Reich. Old men, boys, men with almost no time to train. Give them a tube and tell them to wait in the rubble. That was where the Panzerfaust became terrifying. Open ground made it limited. Ruins made it lethal. A tank on a road is a machine. A tank passing a doorway is a target. A tank moving past a cellar stairwell is already in trouble. The weapon's short-range forced ambushes at near-room distance, and the ruined streets of Berlin turned that distance into a trap. Every doorway could hide a launcher. Every basement could become a firing point. Every corner suddenly had a reason to be feared. The weapon did not need a perfect crew. It needed one person willing to stay still for a second too long. That is all. In the final months of the war, when the Reich was already collapsing under Soviet pressure, that was enough to make Allied tank crews nervous every time they rolled forward. The ledger did not care about courage. It cared about production. It cared about whether the next launcher came off the line, whether the next warhead was fitted, whether the next pallet went to a depot instead of a scrap pile. One ledger entry meant another Panzerfaust in a soldier's hands. Another could mean a tank crew never saw the shot coming. The weapon's design says everything about the moment that produced it. Germany could no longer afford elegance. It could only afford something that worked fast, worked cheaply, and worked in the last 50 meters. By the end of the war, it had become one of the most common battlefield answers to armored vehicles anywhere in Europe. Not a miracle, not a superweapon. Just a tube, a shaped charge, and a doctrine built around hiding in plain sight. When a German infantryman knelt in a shattered street and waited for a Soviet tank to come closer, the weapon in his hands had already done its real work. It had turned a factory calculation into an ambush. The tank kept coming. The launcher stayed cheap. The war got smaller at the point of impact. Number 4. The armored myth. 8.8 centimeters of steel and legend made this tank feel invincible until it was caught intact. In 1942, that was the promise. Germany had built a heavy breakthrough tank around the 8.8 centimeter gun and thick frontal armor, and on paper, it looked like the answer to Allied armor. When it arrived in combat in the summer of 1942, first on the Eastern Front and then in North Africa, it did not behave like a normal tank. It changed the mood first. The Tiger I entered a battlefield and people noticed. The myth grew because the first encounters were so uneven. A Tiger could sit at long range and punch through armor that thought it was still out of reach. Its front armor was around 100 millimeters, with museum figures listing 102 millimeters overall. Its main gun was the 88 millimeters, the same family of weapon that had already built a reputation as a killer of aircraft and tanks. 5 men worked inside a vehicle that weighed 57 tons. It looked unstoppable from the outside. People saw the shell, the gun, the steel face, and the story seemed complete. It never was. The best place to see the gap between image and machine is Tunisia in April 1943. By then, Allied crews had already heard the stories. A Tiger in the desert could freeze in advance. It could break a line. It could make experienced tank men hesitate. Then, on April 24, 1943, near point 174 by Mejez El Bab, British units attacked a German-held ridge and ran into Tiger 131. The moment was not cinematic in the way later memory made it. It was chaotic, confused, and close. Lieutenant Peter Gudgeon's Churchill tank was hit. Nearby, the Tiger's own crew abandoned their vehicle after the turret jammed. Just like that, the machine that had lived in rumor was sitting there almost whole. Tiger 131 mattered because it changed the question from, what did the Tiger seem like, to, what was it actually? On May 7, 1943, British engineers recovered it from the battlefield. That was not just a trophy move. It was intelligence work. A complete Tiger, nearly intact, was a rare thing. Most were destroyed by their crews if they had to leave them behind. The Germans did not like giving away secrets. So when one of these tanks stayed in Allied hands, it became a laboratory on tracks. The armor could be measured, the gun could be studied, the interior layout could be inspected, the weaknesses could be listed instead of guessed. And there were weaknesses. The Tiger was powerful, but it was not simple. It was hungry for fuel. It was mechanically fragile compared with the legend attached to it. Its weight made recovery difficult. Its size made transport and maintenance a burden. A tank that can survive a shot is still not a tank that can survive bad logistics. The front line only sees the part that fires back. It does not always see the breakdown, the missing fuel truck, the recovery vehicle that cannot reach the ditch, the crew waiting for repairs that arrive too late. The Tiger's reputation hid those problems because most soldiers did not meet it in a workshop. They met it on a road, in smoke, moving toward them. That is why the numbers matter. 1,354 Tiger I tanks were produced in total, not millions, not even tens of thousands. A relatively small number spread across a war that covered entire continents. Enough to make an impression, not enough to be everywhere at once. The fear grew because the machine was rare, visible, and deadly when it appeared in the right place. A broken Tiger was often destroyed before anyone could study it. An abandoned Tiger was often too damaged to tell a clean story. Tiger 131 survived because the crew left it behind in one piece. Luck, timing, and a jammed turret turned one battlefield loss into a permanent record. In Tunisia, the Allied side finally got to stop guessing. You can picture the inspection table. The British around the tank with notebooks, tape measures, and hands on cold steel. No battlefield noise now. No shell bursts. Just the dull fact of it. 57 tons of German ambition sitting still under the North African sun. The 88mm gun was there. The armor was there. The fear was there too. But now it had edges. It had dimensions. It had a maintenance story. It had a fuel bill. That is the real split inside the Tiger legend. Officially, it was a heavy breakthrough tank, a monster built to smash through resistance. In practice, it was also a machine that demanded too much from the world around it. It needed support, it needed repair, it needed roads, fuel, and time. Remove those, and the legend started to look more like a very expensive problem with a very large gun. Officially, it was armored certainty. Real life kept handing it mud, breakdowns, and the occasional jammed turret. Number 3. The first terror wave. But the more fear a machine inspires, the more everyone else looks for a way to stop it and to copy its role. 10 seconds of engine roar was enough to make London look up and wait for death. That was the sound the city learned in 1944. Not the bombs themselves. The sound first. A harsh, buzzing pulse in the sky, then silence, then the fall. In the spring of 1944, the V1 was no longer a sketch in a German office. It was waiting on the French coast, hidden in concrete sheds and rough launch ramps. A weapon with a pulse jet bolted to the back and a warhead in the nose. It looked simple, almost crude, but its whole purpose was built around one thing: terror at distance. British intelligence had already seen it before the first launch. In November 1943, Constance Babington Smith and her team at RAF Medmenham studied aerial photographs and confirmed the existence of the German flying bomb. She was not standing on a beach. She was not hearing the engine. She was looking at shadows, shapes, little industrial clues in black and white film. But that was enough. The Allies knew it was coming. That bought time for Crossbow, the bombing campaign against launch sites and storage areas. Time, though, is not the same thing as safety. The V1 had been conceived in 1935. A production order followed in June 1942. By then, the machine had already become something more than an experiment. It was a program, a factory problem, a weapon that could be built in numbers. And numbers mattered here. At least 29,000 were produced. Over 10,000 were launched against Britain from mid-1944. This was not one strange prototype. This was an assault assembled to become a rhythm. On June 13, 1944, 1 week after D-Day, the first 10 V1s were launched against London. A strike in Clapham marked the opening of the campaign. The timing was deliberate. The Allies had just landed in Normandy. Germany answered with a machine that did not need a pilot, did not need courage, and did not care where the war front had moved. It only needed fuel, a launch angle, and a city. The appeal to Hitler was simple: terror, disruption, revenge. The V1 was supposed to make civilians flinch and make governments spend, and it did both. Fighter squadrons had to be shifted. Anti-aircraft guns had to be redeployed. Searchlights, radar crews, labor, concrete, all of it had to be pulled into a new defensive pattern. Britain had already survived the Blitz. It had learned to live under bombs. The V1 forced it to learn something else: how to live under a sound. Because the sound was the weapon. The pulse jet gave the V1 its signature, a mechanical buzz that sounded wrong even before anyone knew what it was. Then, near the end of the flight, the noise cut off abruptly when the engine was nearly out of fuel. That final silence was worse. A city could hear the machine coming. Then, for a few terrible seconds, it could only wait. The bomb was still there. The engine had just gone quiet. Some of the missiles failed. Some were intercepted. Many missed. The V1 was inaccurate, and that matters because it means the campaign never became the clean, unstoppable terror machine Germany imagined. It was messy. It broke down. It was brought down. But it still killed. Nearly 6,000 people in Britain died under the flying bomb campaign. A terrible number. Not because the weapon was perfect, because it was good enough. By June 29, 1944, approximately 2,000 had been launched from 40 operational sites. That pace was the real pressure. Not one blast, not one lucky hit. The sense that another one could come at any moment from the same sky with the same thin, buzzing note. Londoners learned to freeze in that sound, to listen for the pitch, to listen for the cut, to measure the gap between engine roar and impact. And all the while, the Allies were still striking back at the launch system itself. Crossbow hammered the sights. The goal was to slow the campaign before it could fully open. How much did that actually delay the V1? Weeks or months? The sources agree it mattered, but the exact operational impact is still debated. What is clear is simpler. The bombing campaign forced the Germans to keep changing plans, moving equipment, hiding ramps, rebuilding, and trying again. The machine kept arriving, but never quite on the terms it wanted. That is what made the V1 so unsettling. It was not the first bomb. It was not the biggest explosive. It was the first mass-produced cruise missile in history, and it turned fear into a scheduled event. A sound, a pause, a drop. A street in Clapham, a roof, a crater. Then the next one overhead. In that pause, London learned the shape of a new kind of war. Number 2. The weapon from nowhere. 11 seconds too fast to intercept changed the idea of warning forever. At Peenemünde, on October 3, 1942, the first successful V2 test shot up and vanished into the sky. One launch, one clean climb. Germany now had something the Allies could not yet stop. The rocket was built by Wernher von Braun's team, but the number mattered most in that moment. About 3,500 miles per hour, around 200 miles of range, a 2,200-pound warhead falling out of the upper edge of reach. That was not a bomb with a path you could hear coming. It was an arrival. By September 1944, the weapon was being fired against London and Antwerp. The first operational use turned the battlefield into a place where warning came after the strike, if it came at all. Civilians heard a distant crack, sometimes nothing, and then the damage was already there. No siren could chase it down, no fighter could catch it in time. The missile came in faster than the eye could follow and higher than the guns were trained to reach. Germany launched more than 3,000 of them during the war. The campaign was meant to break morale. It did kill. It destroyed buildings. It tore through streets. It made a city look up at empty air and flinch. But many rockets missed. Some fell short. Some went wide. Britain did not surrender. The weapon was terrifying because it seemed absolute, yet its results were uneven enough to frustrate the people using it. That gap mattered. The V2 was not a guaranteed answer, it was a promise of one. The horror was partly invisible. At Mittelbau-Dora, the rockets were assembled underground by forced laborers working in lethal conditions. At least 10,000 prisoners died there making the V2 system. Some died from beatings, some from exhaustion, some from hunger and disease. The weapon that was supposed to arrive from nowhere was built in a place where men were worked toward nothing. When people talk about the V2 as a miracle of engineering, the numbers drag the story back down to earth. A rocket that could cross 200 miles, a payload of 2,200 pounds, a speed of 3,500 miles per hour, a production system so brutal that the factory death toll rivaled or exceeded the battlefield toll in some accounts. The machine did not just point at the future, it was fed by the darkest part of the present. By the end of 1945, the war was over and the race had already started. The United States and the Soviet Union both rushed to seize V2 hardware and the men who understood it. They wanted the rocket, yes. They wanted the drawings. They wanted the guidance systems. They wanted the people who had made it work. The V2 had already done something beyond terror. It had shown that a missile could leave the atmosphere of old warfare behind and move into something new. On May 10, 1946, at White Sands, a captured V2 from Germany became the first successful U.S. launch of its kind and reached 70 miles altitude. That is the strange afterlife of the weapon. The same basic machine that had fallen on London was now climbing towards space. The same hardware that had carried warheads would later carry instruments. The first photos of Earth from space came from the long shadow it cast. That is why the V2 matters so much in the middle of this story. It was a weapon from nowhere in the eyes of the people it hit. It appeared without warning, moved too fast to stop, and left behind a crater before the mind had finished hearing the sound. In the hands of the powers that followed Germany, it became something else. A bridge, a template, a threat that did not end with the war. And the man most closely tied to it, Wernher von Braun, remains a hard question in the record. Technical genius or willing partner? Or both. He led the team. He knew the machine. What he knew about Mittelbau-Dora, and when he knew it, still sits in the contested space between evidence and denial. The rocket is easy to admire from a distance. The human cost is not. So the V2 leaves behind one image, a launch site in the dark, a flame at the base, a second of silence after it rises. Then the sky, empty again, as if nothing had happened. Number 1. The end of one age. 12 days after the first mushroom cloud, history was no longer the same species of history. Now I am become death, the note said, the destroyer of worlds. That line hangs over the men in the New Mexico dark like smoke from a fire nobody wants to light first. The date is July 16, 1945. The place is 210 miles south of Los Alamos. The hour is 5:30 a.m. Trinity. That was the code name J. Robert Oppenheimer chose, drawn from John Donne, a physicist with a poet's word in his mouth, standing in a desert that had become a laboratory for the end of an age. The device on the 100-foot tower was called the Gadget. It was not a finished legend yet. It was a question with wires. Could plutonium be made to explode fast enough, evenly enough, violently enough to become a weapon? The answer came in one flash. The blast released 18.6 kilotons. It vaporized the tower beneath it. It turned sand into glass and night into day. At that moment, everybody there understood what had just happened. Not in theory, in the body, in the chest, in the face. Picture the men around the campfire afterward, not because there was literally a campfire at Trinity, but because memory reaches for heat and smoke when an event is too large to hold in one frame. One man asks if it worked. Another says it did. Somebody laughs once too sharply. Then nobody laughs at all. Big bomb is too small. New weapon is too neat. This was a machine that did not just kill, it changed the scale. For years before Trinity, the bomb had been a research program, a problem in metallurgy, a puzzle in physics, a race against German work and against time, and against the fear that the Nazis might get there first. After the Desert Flash, it was no longer an abstract project in offices and labs. It was a battlefield instrument, a real one that had proved it could work. The war clock started moving faster. Less than 3 weeks later, on August 6, 1945, Little Boy fell on Hiroshima. On August 9, 1945, Fat Man followed over Nagasaki. 2 bombs, 2 cities, 1 new kind of power. The names almost sound playful until you put them next to the ruins they created. Then they sound like something invented by men who knew exactly how much damage needed a softer name. Trinity was the dress rehearsal and the main event at the same time. It proved the plutonium implosion design, the part nobody could be completely sure would work. The simpler gun method would not do for plutonium, so the bomb had to squeeze inward with brutal precision. It had to become a tiny, perfect catastrophe. When it did, the world changed in the instant the light reached the watching men. Some of them were scientists, some were soldiers, some were administrators. All of them were sitting on the edge of a decision that would not stay in the desert. They had built something that could end a city. They had also built something every nation would soon want to understand, copy, fear, and control. That is the turn. The bomb did not just destroy, it demonstrated, it taught. It gave the 20th century a new grammar of power. Sit with that for a second, and the campfire goes quiet. From here on, the old idea of war is gone. Armies still matter, ships still matter, tanks still roll, men still dig trenches and cross rivers and die by the thousand. But now there is a different ceiling overhead, a different answer waiting in the background. A bomb that can turn a city into a warning in one mission. And the warning was heard everywhere. Washington heard it. Tokyo heard it in the fire. Moscow heard it in the strategic math that followed. Every capital that mattered understood the same thing at roughly the same time. The game had changed, and there was no going back to the version with only conventional limits. The bomb did not just end a war, it opened a race. Trinity matters because it was the first proof that the new age was real. A plutonium core, a tower, a dawn sky. Then an absence so absolute it made the old world feel suddenly fragile. The men who watched it knew they had crossed a line. Some would call that line victory. Some would call it necessity. Some would spend the rest of their lives trying not to name it at all. Nobody there saw the same universe after 5:30 a.m. on July 16, 1945. The campfire burns lower. The faces are dim now. Someone stares into the coals without speaking. In the distance, the desert is dark again. The tower is gone. The light is gone. Only the silence remains, holding the shape of what came next.